Failing to frame the problem correctly has led to the misunderstanding that term limits will end corruption in D.C. But do not fear, America. There's a way to begin to reverse the trend of corruption in Washington, and we'll discuss just how to do that on this episode of The First Branch. Union leaders who voted for Biden in the 2020 election are now kicking themselves. The closure of the Keystone Pipeline has cost over 11,000 jobs. And here is what is both funny and sad about the whole thing. They were warned this would happen. Just jump on any conservative podcast and you're going to see the writing on the wall. But before we go into being all, the Dems are so stupid, the Republicans are headed down the very similar path, and that path being that of term limits. But before we get to talking about term limits, remember, this channel exists to inform the American public on developed legislation that actually solves America's problems. So tap that subscribe button and click that bell icon to support this channel and receive notifications of when new content and proposed legislation is posted. Term limits will be the mortal wound to a free America. The false narrative that has been pushed by Republicans plays on the fear of Americans that this is the only way to fix congressional corruption. And that's just nowhere near the truth at all. This law does not seek to end corruption. The first indication of this is the truth that Congress, say they are corrupt. Then who, by their own admission, are corrupt, have exempted themselves from the authority of the proposed amendment. I mean, that is exactly what corruption is. And that's the corruption we want to end. Yet those that are the most corrupt will remain in Congress. So here's the game plan for those who support term limits in Congress. Well, I say they support term limits, but let me be clear about that statement. They support term limits for others, not for themselves. So we need to get that in our heads, America. This law isn't about controlling corruption in Congress. But I digress. So the game plan is simple. Play on America's fears that we are a corrupt governing body. Then admit we are as corrupt as they think we are. Then develop an amendment that requires others, but not us, to adhere to those term limits. And the narrative that we'll broadcast is one that will hide the real solution from the American people. It's a very simple game plan, and it's very effective. So how are they going to hide the real solution? Well, by telling us what we are already predisposed to believing. Americans already believe the Republican Party is for limited government. So any bill they propose is going to be thought of in line with that ideology. The general public also believes this will end cronyism and put a stop to the lobbyist influence and under-the-table payouts. We also believe that staying in power too long corrupts leadership. So these become the talking points to convince the American people that this law is necessary. Are these laws necessary to end the deep-seated corruption in Washington? You betcha, but it ain't in term limits. So I'm going to address each one of these talking points and explain just how term limits will not only not end corruption, but will cause the demise of a free people. And I'm going to start by giving you historical context to this conversation. Our founding fathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence 27 grievances stating exactly why they were rebelling against the crown. Of those 27 grievances, 17 of them were directly related to King George III's failure to respond to the colony's repeated requests to have their petitions heard. It wasn't just about taxation without representation. That tagline just became their version of a meme that we use today. But the majority of their reasoning for rebelling was due to the lack of influence in their own government. And as we look at the Constitution itself, we see that idea reinforced with the conception of the bicameral Congress, specifically how representatives are elected and called to serve. All legislative tax power resides with the House. The Senate has no authority to write or petition tax law. That means every American is to be informed of when a tax would be imposed on them. Therefore, they needed to vote people in that they knew and that they trusted, people from their own community. So how does term limits affect this original intent idea? To answer that question, we have to take a look at the two-party system. When a bill is being presented, the first question we as Americans need to ask is, who does this law impose a restriction on? And why we need to ask this question is because our Constitution was written to limit the government and allow liberty to its citizens. So if a law limits the government, then it's a good law. If it limits the citizen, then it's a bad law. And I would even say that it's unconstitutional. But since our Constitution can be changed through an amendment process, nothing is ever really unconstitutional. It's just unconstitutional till the law gets changed. And that's why I laugh at people who say that they are constitutional Republicans. But that's a conversation for another day. All right, so let's get back to answering these talking points. The trick that Republicans are playing on us is this, that this law is restrictive to the government. After all, it will be the representatives and senators that will have their terms limited, right? And that sounds really good to us average citizens. But that's not where the limit really lies. And I'm going to prove it to you right now. You see, Republicans and Democrats will still be the two parties that are in control. And because these two parties will remain in both the House and the Senate, they are in no way limiting themselves. Because the power is not with the individual congressperson. It is in the party. You disagree? Let me ask you a question. When the news broadcasts election results, who do they say has won? The American people? Or the representatives or senators? Or is the focus on the party and the control it has gained? Yeah, you guessed it. It's the party and the controls that they have gained or lost, not the people. And if that isn't enough evidence, just look at some of our election laws. Right here in the great conservative state of Texas, our election laws prove that the system favors the two-party system. I looked into what it would take to run for office as an independent candidate. Now, I'll admit, it's pretty easy to get on the ballot, but it's the procedures that should concern Americans. As an independent candidate, I would have to wait 1 month after the primary election to get my name on the ballot for the general election. That rule exists to ensure that at least one candidate from each of the two major parties has representation in the election. You see, the rules are in place to protect the party, not the people. I can't make it any clearer, America. All right, so now let's get back and take a look at those limits again. It is the American people who are going to be limited. We will be limited in the number of choices of candidates we have to vote for, not only by party, but now by individuals available to run. And once those limits are capped, what do you think is going to happen? Each party's leadership is going to start moving potential candidates into those contested districts to increase their party's presence. And if you don't think this is already happening, just look at the slogans coming out of the great state of Texas. And what's the most popular slogan right now? Don't California my Texas. The writing is on the wall, America. The Republican Party is duping you to increase their own government control, and they've got you begging for it. The other talking point that Republicans are sharing is that it'll end cronyism because there are limits to how long a person is going to be in office, and that will limit their access to the corruption. This assumes that when a new representative is voted in, they'll be voted in from a different party altogether. This is a ridiculous assumption to make. Not because I said so, but because history says so. The proof of this is on every election night coverage broadcast. The anchors and analysts make statements like, while it may be a close race, but this district or this state is historically left or right. This history has also fed the success of predictions and outcomes for statewide elections. Couple this with the previous statement on how the two-party system is in control, and you start to see how this proposed term limits amendment does nothing to end corruption through cronyism. Because the cronyism isn't just at the individual level. It's at the party leadership level. And make no mistake about it, when it comes to greater government control, both parties want that. The final talking point the supporters of term limits like to bring up is being in power too long is the source of corruption. Again, this statement is a half-truth. The truth is that a long time at the helm of national legislative power does corrupt. Where they are deceiving us is by saying that's the individual who is to blame. The reality is that it's the parties that have been in power for too long. So it doesn't matter who we have in office, the party will remain in power. So the question becomes, how do we then limit the power of the two-party system? Now, when I ask this question, Many think I'm alluding to the addition of a third party into the political landscape, and that's not the solution either. Remember, at the beginning of this episode, I said the Constitution was written to limit the power of federal government and to protect the liberties of its individual citizens. The solution can be found in this idea. And since the majority of corruption stems from monetary greed, that seems like a very good place to start. So if an amendment is going to be recommended, it should limit what Congress makes. There are at least two possible recommendations that I'm going to propose in this episode, with both recommendations being based on an alteration of the portion of Article 1, Section 6 of the U.S. Constitution, which states that senators and representatives shall receive compensation for their services to be ascertained by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. The first proposed amendment can read something like this. All senators and representatives shall receive compensation for their services, if so inclined by the people of their state. If so inclined by the people of their state, the compensation received shall not exceed the mean household income of their home state as determined by the conducted 10-year census. You want corruption to end? Pay them like public servants instead of like celebrities, or even worse, kings and queens. The second proposed amendment would read something like this. Senators and representatives shall receive compensation for their services to be ascertained by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. The amount to be paid out of the Treasury shall not exceed the mean household income of the United States as ascertained by the conducted 10-year census. Do you see the difference in these two recommendations versus what Congress is recommending for itself? These recommendations limit what Congress has available. Their proposal limits what we, the American public, has available. I can't make it any clearer, America. There is an outright attack on our rights and our liberties, and it's being spearheaded by the party that says it hates big government. Just like the union reps that voted for Biden and are now out of jobs. You've been warned. Will you heed the warning or just wait to be laughed at the way y'all are laughing at those Biden supporters looking for work right now? But here's the biggest difference between them and the Republicans being duped. Biden told them what he was going to do, and they voted for him anyway. The Republicans are straight up deceiving you, and they've got you actually begging for it. So if you support this term limits amendment, don't be surprised when in just a few short years you find your conservative districts only have liberals running for office. Because if this episode has done one thing, it has highlighted the trend that Republicans are no longer the party of limited government. And the one thing that angers me most is the conservative political commentary attitude and response towards term limits, which is, term limits are neither here nor there. I can see the value in it, but I'm not going to take a hard stance on this topic one way or the other. Are you kidding me? The conservatives are supposed to be all about original intent. Our representation is the main reason for a 7-year war we fought. You know, that one that began at Lexington and Concord, the one that established a new nation, the one that established a constitution on the idea of limited government. And now it's the party of original intent that is seeking to destroy it. The U.S. Constitution was written so the government would protect our rights. Their power is limited to protecting those rights. And now those rights are under attack. Term limits seek to grant the federal government more power by limiting my right to determine who I want to represent me. Make no mistake about it, America. This is not a small amendment to the Constitution. This idea was worth fighting a bloody 7-year war to build a new country founded on the idea of representation. After all, that is why they wrote it in the very first article of the Constitution, to reinforce the idea of just how important this idea was. And now they're trying to take it away. I love this country. She is truly the greatest country on earth. I have fought on her behalf for 25 years, and I'm going to continue to keep fighting for her for as long as I can. I'm asking all Americans that have a desire to see her stay free to take the recommendations that are posted in the description below, to copy them and send them to your representatives and to your senators. There are links below to find the contact information for your congressperson. I encourage every American to take this seriously. What's at stake is the future of our liberties. As always, I look forward to reading your responses to these episodes. So please leave your feedback in the comment section below. If you write it, you know I'll read it. Thank you again for making time to watch this episode. It means a lot to see the support from our viewers. Have a great weekend, America, and God bless.